So Dwayne didn't tell the full story of why I'm giving this presentation and not anybody else. So in January, the committee met here one weekend, and we met in a little room back there, and we're doing all of our planning, and we had everything, topics, sort of that we knew what we wanted to talk about, but we were weeding through them and weren't quite sure, and everybody said, well, that's a topic we should probably talk about. And everybody's like, yeah, good idea. And one by one went through the topics, and we came to this one, and everybody said, well, who's going to talk about sexual intimacy in our marriages? The room went silent. Everybody went like this, and then quietly someone said, well, I wanted to talk about such and such. Another person said, well, I plan on talking about such and such. And so they quickly picked the topics they wanted, and they said, Scott. So here I am. And this can be an uncomfortable topic. If you're prudish at all, this probably isn't the place for you this afternoon. I trust you won't be, because we're going to talk pretty plainly about some things. I promised my wife I would not bring any personal experience to this talk. At least none you'll know about. But it's something that we don't discuss enough, I think. And we have this main issue in our marriages, and sometimes we struggle with it. And so we're going to talk about some of these things today, and I'm going to use some plain language, nothing obscene, but we're going to get underway here. So, time out for intimacy. Oh, yeah, does anybody need a booklet? And can I maybe have a clock or something so I know where I'm at for time? I do not plan on going overtime, however. So while Dwayne's passing out those books, so James had his talk about, what do you call it? Yeah, social media earlier today. And I'm on Facebook quite a bit, I admit it. About the only thing I'm on. Have a Twitter account that I really don't pay any attention to at all. Besides that, I tried Instagram for about 2 weeks and I couldn't see the point. People posting pictures, I was like, I don't have any pictures to post. So anyway, so as Dwayne mentioned, I mentioned something about this on Facebook the other day. And one of the responses I got from a friend was this. First of all, do any of you remember the show The Brady Bunch? How many of you remember that? Okay. So hopefully you'll get this. There's one episode where Marcia, the oldest daughter, I believe she's taking a driver's test. And she's all nervous about it. It's sort of one of the classic Brady Bunch episodes, I guess. She's all nervous about it. And her instructor says to her, well, to not be nervous, just imagine everybody you're passing while you're driving is in their underwear, and it'll make you laugh and comfortable. So that's what someone posted on my Facebook page. If you get nervous during your adult topic presentation, do what Marcia Brady did, and just imagine everybody is in their underwear. Then he said, oh, wait, maybe not for this topic. So anyway, I just thought I'd share that with you. So the very first thing we want to talk about is what actually is intimacy in our marriages. If you have your booklets in front of you, sex is a culmination of intimacy with our spouse, but intimacy is much more than sex. Men and women typically have different understandings of what intimacy is. Now, this is a big issue for men and women in our marriages. All I'll say about this is this was true for my wife and I when we first got married. I didn't understand what intimacy meant and how what happens outside of the bedroom every day plays into the intimacy in your marriage. So I have some pictures there on that first page. I say, this is intimacy. It's a couple obviously close. But so is giving your wife a foot massage and helping her with the chores and doing some scrapbooking with her. And then finally, the last picture, but probably not this, which is him on his electronic device, and she obviously not happy with that situation. So what we find is that for most men, thoughts of intimacy are tied directly to sex. I'll just say that as plainly as I can. And I want to read to you first from Proverbs 5:19. Hopefully this is working. Okay. Proverbs 5 and verse 19. Okay. It says there, as a loving hind and a graceful doe, talking about his wife, or a wife, let her breast satisfy you at all times. Be exhilarated always with her love. Okay, so that's just some advice from Solomon. There's a few things we can take from that simple statement. One, to most men, their wife's anatomy is a very important part of how they view them. Whether women like that or not, it is a very true thing. And Solomon recognized it way back here. Two, that same realization and recognizing that fact also can lead us men into things that we shouldn't be getting ourselves into. And we're going to address that a little bit later. Okay, then I'd like to read from Song of Solomon, chapter 7, and verses 7 and 8. Because Solomon was pretty plain in some of his language, okay? And I think we shy away from these things because they're uncomfortable. And they aren't things that we need to talk about all the time, because these are private issues often should be between husbands and wives. But there's things we don't know about. We have questions that we ask, things that are in our mind that we wonder, is that normal? Is that right? How do other people view it? And the scripture gives us some answers. It says, your stature is like a palm tree, and your breasts are like its clusters. Now hope you don't blush too much here, but this is Solomon. I said, I will climb the palm tree. I will take hold of its fruit stalks. Oh, may your breasts be like clusters of the vine, and the fragrance of your breasts like apples. That was Solomon's presentation of how men view their wives. Okay? So that is a very important part of sexuality and intimacy to most men. Okay, so I just want to establish that. Now, on the other hand, for most women, thoughts of intimacy are interwoven with how they're feeling about everything that's going on in their life at the moment. How many of you are familiar with Mark Gungor at all? Watched any of his stuff? Okay. He gives an excellent presentation. He's a pastor of a church near Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I think. And he does a presentation called Laughing Your Way to a Better Marriage. And interwoven, he does a secondary presentation also. It's about sexuality and marriage. But this primary presentation, he points out the differences between men and women. And one of the things he talks about in this presentation, it's a great video. I think it's an hour and a half. I'd recommend it to anybody who would like to see more of that kind of thing. Women's brains, he terms them, they're like spaghetti, where you have all this stuff that's interwoven, everything, from putting the kids to bed, to sex with their husband, to what's going on at the grocery store. All of that combines together in their heads and just going around all the time. Very, very complex. Men, on the other hand, can put things in a box, pretty much. They can go from this thing, I want sex with my wife, I want it now. I know I was yelling at her 2 minutes ago, but that doesn't matter to me, okay? And I think if you're an observer of human nature, you know that's very much true. And it may be true in your own marriages as well. So there's those differences there. Another thing we have to take into account that we really shy away from when it comes to things going on in the bedroom, true intimacy is non-existent unless Yahweh is part of the equation. I'll say I don't believe in this dichotomy we have between the secular and the sacred. Let me explain that a little bit. If we are Yahweh's, if we belong to Him, if we're His, everything we do in this life is sacred. It's holy. It's part of who we are. It's part of being set apart. And that includes intimacy in the bedroom. How many of you would even consider praying before you engage in any kind of intimacy with your spouse? Or is that just the secondary thought? Okay, there's some of you here who have thought that through. Because we want Yahweh to be a part of that pure thing that he's given us to, the primary purpose, of course, is to raise a righteous seed for him, to build a kingdom for Yahweh. That's the primary purpose of having children. But in that, he also allows us to have pleasure. He allows us to have joy in that. He allows us to connect with our spouse in a way that we can connect with nobody else on the face of this earth. So Yahweh needs to be part of that equation. And then I'd also like to point out that intimacy only occurs when mutual respect is present in all aspects of your marriage. If your marriage is on the rocks, if it's falling apart, if you're arguing with your spouse all the time, don't expect intimacy to just be a separate thing that you can just boom, and you're good to go. Because you can't compartmentalize that. It's all part of the package. Especially, like I said, for women. All these things are going to be tied together in their minds. For us men, sometimes it doesn't matter so much. But if you want to be happy men, how does the saying go? Happy wife, happy life. And that's overstating it a bit. But there's some truth to that. Treat your wife like a queen 24/7, and then when you have the desire to hit the bedroom, then she's probably all in. If you're not treating her well, then maybe not so easy. All right. Another scripture I want to read here is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So that's just all sort of to introduce this topic, to point out some of the differences between men and women, because we need to recognize those in order to have a successful, intimate relationship with our husband or wife. Okay. 1 Corinthians 7, I have part of there what I want to read, but I want to read a little bit more. And, okay. Verses 3 through 5 say this. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Stop depriving one another except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But this I say by way of concession, not of commandment. I have seen in counseling situations and just hearing men talk over the years, so many use that verse to say, you owe me your body. I control it. What's the problem with that? The problem with that, first of all, is the Apostle Paul is saying here, this is my thought, this is my idea. Was he inspired by Yahweh? Yes, of course he was. But it is not a means, sex can never be a means to control your spouse. Withholding. Now, again, I'm just going to go by what I think is the most likely scenario. More often than not, it will be the wife who is withholding from her husband because the husband needs that satisfaction more often and more immediately than the wife does. So there's many, many wives that I both counseled and heard talk before that they'll use this as a means to control their husband's behavior in some way. Of course, it doesn't work. At the end, all it means is you have a crappy marriage, right? If I can use that term. All right. Let's go into the next section. What does good sex look like? Different needs for men and women. We want to touch on that, the different stages of life, frequency of your intimacy, etc. Okay. So, we'll touch on women first. Not only is how you treat your wife 24/7 important to you having a satisfying, intimate, and sexual relationship with her, men, but during the act itself, okay, I'll try not to embarrass any of us here, but women typically need more time and attention and getting to a certain point of satisfaction, okay? We men, on the other hand, oftentimes can be just like, bam, I'm done, thank you, all right, job finished. Men, don't do that to your wives, okay? Now, there's many things that come into play that we're not even going to address here today. Illness, different situations. We will a little bit in a section later on here. But again, the whole idea of this, and I want to get back to this, is that Yahweh needs to be involved in this, in your intimacy with your spouse, and that you are trying not to be selfish in this act. And I'm going to say it again, men tend to be very selfish. And if there's any young men in the room, newly married or people who are going to get married, I want you to remember that, okay? Don't ignore your wife's needs, because this is one of the greatest disconnects in young marriages, I think, is when the husband doesn't understand that the wife is physically different, emotionally different, and has different needs to get enjoyment out of sex than what you do, okay? This isn't a selfish act. It's a mutual act where you can both get pleasure and satisfaction out of this. All right. I sort of made that the next point I was going to mention in the brochure here. It's intended to bring complete physical pleasure and spiritual connection to both spouses. Again, I want to emphasize those two go hand in hand. Physical satisfaction and pleasure without spiritual connection to your spouse is just that. It's nothing more. There's no connection. And that's why some men and some women can carry on their whole lives with this idea that it's okay to go from one sexual partner to another because it means nothing more to them than that physical pleasure. That's not the way Yahweh designed it. It's a very important thing. And then finally, another point of what good sex looks like is the entire body and mind should be involved. So, again, to speak plainly, when you're in bed with your husband or wife, let's start with the women first. Women, I just mentioned that your brains tend to be connected in all these ways, and you're thinking about a whole bunch of things at all times, 24/7. And it's almost like Yahweh designed you that way, and you can't help it, and I understand that. But when you're giving intimate attention to your husband, do not be thinking about your grocery list, okay? You need to give your full attention to what's happening between you and your husband so that you can not be selfish and give him what he needs. On the other side of that, husbands, we have a different problem. And we're going to address it more a little bit later here. You have an obligation to be thinking of your wife and only your wife and no other person when you're involved in that physical connection with her. Under no circumstances should you ever be thinking about some model you saw on TV or even outside the marriage bed, right? Men, you can't do that. You can't do that to your wives, okay? So everything you have, your entire body and mind need to be involved in this act. All right, we'll go on to the next section, the sanctity of sex and intimacy. Okay, if we look at Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4. You would think with these electronic devices, stupid machines or whatever they're being called this weekend, things would go a lot faster. But I actually find turning pages of my Bible works better for me anyway. But anyway, Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4, this is some instruction we receive. Marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. For fornicators and adulterers, Yahweh will judge. Let me read that again. Marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. For fornicators and adulterers, Yahweh will judge. It is a sacred act between a husband and wife. Yahweh designed it that is the only allowable place for sexual intimacy between a husband and a wife. And just as an aside, that's why the whole homosexual agenda, the whole homosexual marriage thing that we have going on in this country, and really over a lot of places in the Western world right now, is so dangerous because it cuts right to the heart and tears down this most intimate act that Yahweh allows only between a husband and a wife. And if our adversary can accomplish tearing that apart and corrupting it in any way, then it tears the family apart. And it makes it impossible for us to raise children that are righteous seed to Yahweh. Like Pastor Ferris mentioned, Yahweh has no grandchildren. He only has children. And that's our goal, to raise righteous children to Yahweh. Malachi chapter 2 tells us that. Okay. So there's an expectation that it's a very sacred thing between a husband and a wife. And then I want to talk about maintaining boundaries. We're talking about boundaries a lot this weekend in different ways. But I want to read from Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. And verses 27 and 28. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. So we'll go on and read the rest of it in a minute. Up to this time in Judaism, or during this time in Judaism, things had gotten so far off track that the only thing that had any meaning to the people of that time was a very specific, literal application of the law. So as long as there was no physical, sexual intimacy going on, there was no adultery. That was their view of the world. Okay? Yahshua comes along and says this, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Men, there is no out on this one. There is no seeing a beautiful woman. Okay, let me back up a minute. We are physiologically and biologically designed as men to react to physical pleasure. And I don't think there's any way around this. When we see a beautiful woman, the reaction is to admire that. That's a 1-second thought that can pop into your head. The minute that goes anywhere else besides that, it is turned into lust. And Yahshua said, you have no business going there. So it's not all right to dwell on another woman. And we're going to get into the pornography thing just a little bit here in a couple minutes. Sometimes women have a problem with this as well. It's not as common, but sometimes they do. Okay. So that's an admonition that Yahshua gave. But let's talk about a few other things. There are many men and women both who are very comfortable being friends with members of the opposite sex. It might be somebody they knew before they were married. It might be somebody they're just comfortable with in a certain setting. And I can't say any of that is explicitly wrong. But I can say this. If your husband or your wife is not your most intimate confidant, if they're not your best friend, if they're not the ones that you're sharing your deepest secrets with, then you have a problem. Even if it's another man, a buddy, be very careful what you share. Be very careful what you share in a counseling session if your spouse isn't there. I mean, all of these things we have to think about. So just be careful with your interaction with the opposite sex. And like I said, you can't say it's necessarily wrong, but there's natural attraction that happens. And how many of the, I'll say the ministers in here, but others of us know of instances where something started out as innocent can be, especially online these days. Talk about social media here now, where It's an innocent conversation you're having with somebody on Facebook. It's all public. Next thing you go, it's a private messaging on Facebook. Next thing you know, you're doing this when your husband or wife walks into the bedroom or living room or wherever you're sitting with the laptop or your phone or whatever. Or you find yourself erasing histories on your electronic devices. All of those things should be a cue in your own mind that you have a problem and you've gone too far in whatever this relationship is, whatever you perceive it to be. So we need to set up careful boundaries, whether it's in person or on social media. My wife and I have always had a rule that, well, a couple different things. One, any friends we've had, we've always done things with couples, okay? I don't have private conversations with women. She doesn't have private conversations with men, at least not unless it's in a public setting and it's about whatever. I mean, it happens in services like this where we all interact, and that's all fine, and we understand that. But not going off in the corner somewhere and having conversations. So those are things that we need to be very careful about. I remember a long time ago, and this is a policy that I have personally. Billy Graham, whatever you think of him, good or bad, I don't know, but that's okay. He had a policy in place from early on in his ministry that he was never, ever alone with a woman who wasn't his wife or one of his daughters. He just would not put himself in that situation. And there's another thing I have in place, and this is something you should know about me if you ever come to me for any kind of counseling. I will share what you tell me with my wife. And I just say that up front to anybody who asks me. Because the whole idea of all of this intimacy we're talking about is a oneness that we have, right? And so sometimes there's things I'm told that I need to share with somebody. And I'm not going to run to my best buddy and tell him. I'm going to bounce it off my wife and get her opinion and her advice. And that's the kind of closeness we're trying to develop here. Okay. And then finally, just in general, sharing private information about yourself or your spouse or your marriage, whether it's your best girlfriend, your best buddy, whatever, don't do it. Unless you specifically understand that your wife or your husband is okay with this kind of thing, don't speak out of turn about personal things in your life, especially your marriage, especially sexual things, because those are very private, even as we're talking about them publicly today. Okay, section number 4, the part I really don't want to address or talk about at all. Debated whether to put this in here. The reason I put it in here is because I've had questions about what is appropriate in the marriage bed. Okay? So I'm briefly just I gave some brief examples of things that people have questions about. I will say this. As long as you and your wife are comfortable with it, and it doesn't involve any other person or any images of any other person or any kind of pornography, then I say that is between you and your spouse. So, maybe if you have more specific questions about those kind of things, you can ask me later. But nothing I see on that page under section number 4 scares me away as long as you and your spouse have agreement on it. But anything that goes outside of or brings anything else or anyone else into the marriage bed, I'd say is totally inappropriate. Totally inappropriate. Okay? So I'm just going to leave that one there for now. All right, let's talk about pornography for a little bit. I want to read the scripture here. We touched on one verse in Proverbs 5, but I want to read a whole section there because really that passage I took was somewhat out of context because there's an admonition there that we want to read. So Proverbs chapter 5, beginning with verse 15. It says, drink water from your own cistern and fresh water from your own well. Should your springs be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be yours alone and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. As a loving hind and a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times. Be exhilarated always with her love. For why should you, my son, be exhilarated with an adulteress and embrace the bosom of a foreigner? There's been many, many studies done in the last, 15, 20, 25 years or more. And you've probably all heard them. But men's brains seem to be wired in such a way, again, I'll say the way Yahweh created us, that visual images, especially sexual images, take root in our minds. And once they do, it's very, very difficult for us to get rid of them. It gets imprinted on the brain so deeply that the danger is if we see inappropriate images of nudity, sexual relations, pornography, whatever of any kind, the danger is that is there forever. And it does two things. I'll just read this here. It reconditions our sexual expectations from an act of sacred love to an act of lust. What it will do is give us, let me back up just a second. So the idea, of course, of people who are trying to trap us into viewing pornography and other things is a very human thing, and that is to present a better image than reality. Okay? So, and it's not much different than how we act on Facebook, for instance, where we present only what we want to present to people. But this is a very much more demeaning and ruining thing to our society. So men get that image imprinted on their brain. And then the next thing that happens is they're comparing unrealistic images to the reality of their wife. Okay? And then the satisfaction goes out the door. Because she's not living up to some kind of distorted, unrealistic image of what a real woman is like. Okay? In that passage we just read, Solomon said, let me just read it one more time. In verse 19, as a loving hind and a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times. Let her breast satisfy you at all times. When you're young and just first married, things are looking good, right? I'm just going to say that. But like you, gentlemen, who get old and out of shape and your gut gets bigger and you get saggy all over, so does your wife, okay? But that's okay because she's your wife. And you have to look to her for satisfaction always, all the days of her life. As she ages, as her body ages, you learn to appreciate every step of that along the way. Every year that goes by, because she's yours and she's nobody else's. And you're hers and nobody else's. And then the final thing I want to say about this whole pornography issue, because here's a thing I've heard from some believers even. As long as both spouses agree, and that's back up to the point number 4, as long as both spouses agree, then it's okay. We can view these images together. We can watch these videos together, whatever. It's a bunch of nonsense, because I tell you what, wives, if your husband's trying to get you to do that sort of thing, it's going to ruin him. It's going to ruin him, and then it'll ruin your marriage. Don't allow that into your house. Don't allow it into your bedroom. Don't allow it into your life, because that's not how Yahweh designed things to be. Be satisfied with one another. Okay, What to do when things go wrong. So, we lead busy lives that are full of stress, like we heard this morning. We have things going on at work, things going on here and there and everywhere. And some of the things that can go wrong in our intimate and sexual relationships, just list of them here: a loss of desire. And that can happen for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's just hormones in both men's and women's bodies. It does happen, that affect our brains. Sometimes people are on medication, especially as we age, and different things come into play there. Sometimes we're just too busy. We're too tired. We have some kind of physical issue where we can't meet the performance standards that's expected of us. Those are all things that can be dealt with fairly easily. Those are things that are physical, and so there's usually ways to work around those. And sometimes it's just a matter of patience with your spouse, with what they're going through. Okay? The next one, loss of mutual respect. That's probably the most damaging. When I've talked to people who are having trouble with their intimate relationships and in their marriage, and they need counseling, by the time they get to this point where they've lost mutual respect for one another, I would say in my dealings with people and counseling people, about 75% of the time when they're to that point, the marriage is beyond repair. That's been my experience. And why it's so very important, not only in our sexual relationships as husband and wife, but in our day-to-day life, that we never lose that mutual respect for one another. So depending on what the problem is, there's different ways to resolve these things. Most often, in a good marriage relationship, the sexual issues are resolved by just giving each other space and time and talking it out like you normally would any other problem that you're having. And don't get all excited and worked up about it and say, this is a terrible thing. Because if you have a good relationship in general, you'll usually be able to work these things out. But sometimes you do need help. Now, I'm going to say something here that you may or may not agree with. Oftentimes in our sacred name assemblies here, we go to the elders for counseling about things. And that's fine. That's part of our job. That's what we're here for. But sometimes we're not qualified to deal with certain issues, especially issues like these when there's medical conditions and things like that. But some of these most intimate things, some of us have had more experience dealing with them than others. So I'm not afraid to say you should feel free to find qualified counseling wherever that qualified counseling is. Don't think that the pastor of your congregation and elder of your congregation are the only people you can go to when you need help, because you're setting yourself up for failure in some of our congregations, and it's just the way it is. We just have not had a lot of experience in these kind of things. And like I say, some are naturally better at it than others. So don't be afraid to search those things out when you need to. Books are great sometimes, but if you're like me, I'm a lot more impressionable when someone says to me, Scott, here's what you need to do to change, rather than me reading in a book, dear reader, here's what you need to do to change and to fix your sexual relationship. Okay, now maybe some of you can read that book and get that advice and it works for you. And that's okay. Okay, time goes a lot faster than I thought. We have about 3 minutes left, so I just want to quickly cover section number 7, single people's sex expectations. Did you know that even within our sacred name congregations, young single people have sex with each other before they're married? Is anybody out here who has blinders on and thinks that doesn't happen, hasn't ever happened, and won't happen again? It does happen. It should never happen, but it does happen. Because just like every other person out in the world, that desire is so strong, and society has taught us how to manipulate each other into getting what we want. And when that desire is there in the first place, some young people just don't wait. And of course, we know that leads to a whole host of problems. If it's a person that they don't end up marrying, that experience is imprinted on their brain forever to the detriment of their marriage and their future spouse. Pregnancy is a terrible thing when you have no support system. 17, 18-year-old gets pregnant. Young man of the same age, he has no way to support a wife and baby. And that child's life is less than what it could have been. That legacy is off to a bad start. Okay, and let's just read a couple scriptures here. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, okay, and verse 9. Or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of Yahweh? Do not be deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor homosexuals, nor thieves, nor the covetous, nor drunkards, or revilers, or swindlers shall inherit the kingdom of Yahweh. Such were some of you, but you were washed, but you were sanctified, but you were justified in the name of the Master Yahshua the Messiah and the Spirit of Yahweh. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. That's a key scripture if you're a young person and you want to be married someday. There is no allowance for sex outside of marriage in Yahweh's plan. It doesn't exist. You can talk yourself into almost anything, but it is not there in the Word. It's absolutely not there. Like he said, all things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. And that's the key if you're a young person. If you're struggling with this, you need to find somebody to talk to. In Romans chapter 12, we'll read that here in a minute. Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of Yahweh, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to Yahweh, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of Yahweh is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. As a young unmarried person, hoping to be married someday, even if you aren't, this is your calling right here. This is your calling. Present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to Yahweh, which is your spiritual service of worship. So there's an expectation that Yahweh has control over our bodies and what we do with them until that time we're married. And then finally, just a quick note, if you're in an engagement or a betrothal of some kind, that's a time when it is appropriate to start thinking about these things, to seek counsel about expectations for intimacy and sex. Because I can tell you what, and it may be a hard thing to do, and human beings have gotten through it for many, many years, but it's going to be a lot different than what you expect. It is going to be a lot different than what you expect. It's a very joyful thing to have an intimate relationship with another human being where you share the deepest parts of your heart. You share your body completely and totally with someone. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. But it's something unlike you've ever experienced before. And that's why it's such an awesome experience. And that's why we can't allow for any kind of corruption to be brought into that relationship. All right, that's all I got for you.